Hey, welcome back to Pop Culture Graveyard. This week we pay tribute to the comedy giant, Carl Reiner. So this is a different kind of episode. I usually cover mostly music, but it's Pop Culture Graveyard, so there's no way I couldn't comment on someone who's given such riches to pop culture. Carl Reiner was a huge influence on me. I love him as a performer, as a writer, as a director. He succeeded in every single format he tried his hand at. The guy's got like 9 Emmys. He's got a Grammy. He was a writer, a director, a producer. For about 2 decades, everything Carl Reiner touched, comedy-wise, turned to gold. Carl directed a lot of great comedy movies. Some were major successes, like Oh God, or The Jerk, and some were smaller successes that people in the comedy world really love, like The One and Only, or Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, which I saw in the theater, Thank You Mom. He was a great actor. He seemingly could do it all. If there was one gift that Carl Reiner had, I think above all the rest, it was that he could make everyone else look good. He was the consummate straight man. He was the perfect foil to any crazy character that all of these comedians, from Mel Brooks to Steve Martin to anyone, could come up with. He was just brilliant at playing it straight. He was brilliant at playing comedy as well. He had a lot of tools in his comedy tool belt. Now, trying to do an overview of a career with the breadth of Carl Reiner's is kind of a futile gesture. I will focus instead on just a few underrated gems, in my opinion, in the overall Carl canon. First off, The Thrill of It All, featuring Doris Day and James Garner. Doris Day made a ton of movies, usually with Rock Hudson, but she made a couple with James Garner. This movie came out in 1963, but I point this out because Carl wrote the screenplay. This is his first screenplay credit. It's based on a story by Larry Gelbart. Larry Gelbart, of course, was later the comedy force behind the TV show MASH. Anyway, Carl wrote the screenplay, and it's a funny screenplay, especially funny by 1960s standards, because you have the obligatory convertible car driving into the swimming pool. Keith Moon approved. You have the swimming pool filling up with suds. How do you get rid of all these suds in the pool? Why, you hire a fleet of trucks to load the suds in them and drive them away. So it's very wacky in a 60s way, but Carl manages to not let the farces get in the way of the storyline, and it's actually a pretty fun film. The best part of this film for me are the sections that feature Carl Reiner himself performing 3 different characters in the movies within the movie. Doris Day's character becomes a spokeswoman for Happy Soap, which is the only soap her kids like. And the live commercials Doris cuts for Happy Soap happen to always be in between a Carl Reiner TV movie that he's starring in. First as like a Nazi, secondly as this kind of creepy Lothario, and the third as a cowboy. And the great thing about this part that he wrote for himself is that his dialogue in all of the movies are exactly the same, as is his character. It's just that he's wearing a different uniform or costume or outfit. And it's a sly joke about the quality of TV movies that were produced at that time and the verisimilitude that they all had. So Carl did a fantastic job with this. A lot of elements of this movie are pretty dated, but it's still kind of a fun romp today. And it's even directed by the great Norman Jewison. So I think you might want to check this out. Staying in 1963, and staying with the theme of wacky 1960s movies, It's a Mad World. Did I leave out a mad? I think I got it. Is one of those rare 1960s movies that, although it suffers from Casino Royale disease, which is too many actors, too many cameos, everybody jostling for the spotlight, it still manages to be highly entertaining. It's held up well, and I think it's held up well most of all because the director was not a comedy director. The director was Stanley Kramer, who is known for his dramas. He did Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, so he's a highly talented dramatic director, which I think is the only way that you could control this situation. with this many comedians, especially old-time comedians, who were never shy about trying to get into the spotlight. There are an awful lot of classic big-time comedians here, but Carl Reiner manages to make his presence felt with a rather small but impactful cameo. Carl plays an air traffic controller who, when his buddy, who is trying to flag down a plane, falls over the ledge of the tower and is hanging by a cord, it's up to Carl to try to wave the plane away. And he does this as the plane is driving towards him, and the stuntman just kept on heading towards him, and at the last second, the stuntman turned the plane and went past, kind of grazed his head. Carl said he literally touched the plane with his hand. That's how close it was, and that's how good the stuntman was. And upon hearing the word cut, Carl, much in the way that old actors used to cry, "Make up!" in between takes, looked down at the crowd of 200-something onlookers and shouted, "Underwear!" That apparently got the biggest laugh of anyone, on screen or off, for the entire production. And since we're talking about genius comedian Carl Reiner, here's another genius, Jack Davis, who did the beautiful artwork on the It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. Did I throw an extra mad in there? Anyway, Carl shows once again that even with a small cameo, he can make his presence felt. And speaking of making his presence felt, Carl carries the movie, The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming. This movie came out in 1966 and was further proof that the Cold War wasn't going anywhere. Directed again by his old pal Norman Jewison from The Thrill of It All, and with a script by award-winning screenwriter William Rose. This movie is a clinic on Cold War paranoia. Carl Reiner plays Walt Whitaker, who lives on this tiny, fictional island of Gloucester. It's supposedly right off Cape Cod, and it's bustling with tourists during the summer. But this is off-season, so Carl and his family and the rest of the locals only number about 200. When a Russian sub runs aground, Carl and the rest of the island freak out. Carl has the lead role here, opposite Alan Arkin. Alan Arkin is, of course, brilliant as usual as a lieutenant who is on the Russian sub who is tasked with going to get help. Emergency! Everybody to get from street! The whole movie's brilliant. There's a fantastic physical comedy sequence in here where Carl Reiner is roped with an old lady, and the two try desperately to free themselves. And Carl was never funnier on screen. Jonathan Winters is great. We've just got to get organized. Eva Marie Saint, who plays Carl Reiner's wife, is fantastic. But if Carl doesn't nail his part, the entire movie falls apart. And Carl nails his part. So I highly recommend you check out The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming, if you have not. Incidentally, check out the great artwork, again, by the great Jack Davis. Just one swinging 60s year later, in 1967, Carl Reiner appeared in The Guide for the Married Man, which is based on a book by Frank Charloff. This was a bestseller, and it was supposedly told to Frank Charloff, but it is, of course, by Frank Charloff. And as you can tell just from the design, it was aimed at men. I was first introduced to this movie as a very young child who was way too young for this movie. It was playing on the 4:30 movie on WABC in New York, and I would tune in hoping to see one of my Planet of the Apes movies. And instead I was treated to this sexy, sexy, sexy movie. Dated and sexist by today's standards, I still find it playful and kind of sweet by the end of it. It's played for laughs. It is over the top. It's never more so over the top than when the cavalcade of stars who are making cameos begin performing their sketches of adultery. And Carl Reiner is, of course, for me anyway, the most impactful of all of the stars who make cameos here. Joey Bishop acquits himself well. He's hysterical. Lucille Ball is great. Art Carney. All of the old-time comedians are here, and they do a good job. Phil Silvers. But Carl Reiner really introduces the major plot point of the movie very well in his sketch. Carl Reiner plays a big movie star called Rance G. Rance G is attempting to commit adultery with a young starlet on the lot, played by the beautiful Linda Harrison, who later played Nova on My Beloved Planet of the Apes. So the 4:30 movie was trying to give me a little Apes content. Anyway, Carl as Rance goes through ridiculous lengths to avoid his wife and commit adultery, only to be foiled in the end. So I highly recommend this movie just as a 60s curio if you've never seen it. And Carl, of course, is brilliant in it. Incidentally, the music for this is by John Williams, who back then was going by Johnny Williams. And the title track for the movie is by the Turtles, which is a fun little song. Finally, I've said that Carl was a master of all formats, none more so than TV. He even had a few series. Some were more successful than others. One that I always liked was Lots of Luck. Pronounced by Dom DeLuise, the star of the show, as Lots of Luck. It's not for everyone, but it is executive produced by Carl Reiner. It's created by Carl with two stalwart writers from the Dick Van Dyke Show, Bill Persky and Sam Denoff. It's based on a British show, On the Buses. The show sort of reads like a cross between the TV show The Honeymooners and the movie Marty with Ernest Borgnine. Dom works for the bus company, but he's kind of locked in a cage in the Lost and Found section of the bus company. Dom DeLuise stars as Stanley Belmont. It's this guy who's living in his family home with his overbearing mother, Kathleen Freeman, who is awesome, and his sister, Olive, played by Beverly Sanders from CPO Sharkey, and her brother-in-law, Arthur, played by Win Irwin, is the bane of Stanley's existence. And a lot of the plots have to deal with him not being able to stand his brother-in-law, who eats like a horse, who's always in his bathrobe, who's always applying salve to different parts of his body that we don't see. It's got cameos by people like Suzanne Summers, Ruth Buzzy. Dom is always having a romantic interlude that goes hardly wrong, usually because of his family. Anyway, it is a fun TV show. It had one season, I believe 22 episodes before it was axed. But if you get the chance to watch it, is Nick at Night still a thing? Give it a ride. Carl was the consummate sideman, the consummate straight man, and I think because of that he didn't get a lot of the attention he deserved. Case in point, I have lots of books about comedy, lots of books about comedy writers, lots of books about the classic age of television. One of them is seriously funny, and that's Mort Saul on the cover. But it covers people like Sid Caesar, Ernie Kovacs, Steve Allen, Stan Freberg, Lenny Bruce, Bob Newhart, even David Fry is represented. There's no section on Carl Reiner. There's even a section on Mel Brooks, but not Carl Reiner. However, when you go to the index and you look up Carl Reiner, he's on dozens of pages. He features prominently on many pages on lots of other people in the book because he was always behind the scenes. He was always punching up someone else's work. He was helping direct something. He was turning a stage play into a book or a book into a movie. And in a lot of cases, he was doing two-hander stuff like him and Mel Brooks. In the world of comedy, he was pretty much a Swiss Army knife. If it was funny, Carl could do it. He is going to be missed. It's a wonder he stuck around as long as he did. I think part of the key of that is he and Mel Brooks are madly in love. Would someone please check on Mel Brooks? It's a shame that Carl left us, but the guy was in his 90s. He outlived Prince and David Bowie. I think he worked hard enough for us. I'll be back next week, probably with more music for you, but I would be remiss if I didn't pay tribute to one of the great comedy icons of my childhood and my adulthood. So rest in peace, Carl Reiner. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please hit the subscribe button, and I will see you next week. Emergency! Everybody to get from street.